In the affluent neighborhoods of Chicago, 2010, a shocking murder unraveled the glamorous life of millionaire Richard Calloway. Found stabbed in his lavish penthouse, the crime revealed a scandalous affair with an unexpected lover, his wife's polar opposite. The investigation uncovered a tale of obsession, insecurity, and betrayal, leaving a community wondering, how could love spiral so tragically? Richard Calloway had always been the man others aspired to be. Born into a modest family in 1972, he grew up in the suburbs of Chicago, with big dreams but few opportunities. His father worked as a mechanic, and his mother was a part-time librarian. From an early age, Richard showed a remarkable aptitude for technology. He would tinker with old radios and computers, often spending hours alone in the garage, piecing together broken gadgets. By the time he was in high school, he had built his first computer, earning him a reputation as the neighborhood genius. Richard's hard work eventually paid off. In 1994, he graduated from MIT with a degree in computer science and founded Calloway Innovations, a tech company that would go on to revolutionize cloud computing. By the early 2000s, he was a millionaire, with his name frequently appearing on the covers of business magazines. But despite his professional success, Richard struggled with deep-seated insecurities. He felt out of place among the wealthy elite, haunted by the belief that he didn't truly belong. His reserved personality and working-class roots left him feeling overshadowed by the more charismatic men in his social circle. Everything seemed to change when he met Vanessa in the 2005 at a corporate event in New York. Vanessa was a former runway model who had transitioned into philanthropy after retiring from fashion. Her beauty was breathtaking, but it was her intelligence and confidence that captivated Richard. To him, she was everything he had ever dreamed of: poised, elegant, and radiant. They married in the 2007 in a lavish ceremony that made headlines in the society pages. But as their marriage progressed, Richard's insecurities began to fester. Vanessa's stunning looks and magnetic presence drew attention wherever they went. At social events, men would steal glances at her, and she was often the center of conversations. Though Vanessa never gave him a reason to doubt her loyalty, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't enough. He began overcompensating, buying her extravagant gifts and throwing lavish parties to prove to himself and to others that he deserved her. By the 2010, their marriage had become a picture-perfect facade. Richard was distant, often immersing himself in work to avoid confronting his feelings of inadequacy. Vanessa, though gracious and kind, began to sense the growing emotional distance between them, but chose not to press him. For Richard, the pressure of maintaining this illusion was overwhelming. He felt like a guest in his own life, always waiting for someone to expose him as a fraud. It was during this time that Richard met Debbie Hawkins at a charity gala in downtown Chicago on the night of October 14th, 2010. The event, hosted to raise funds for underprivileged children, brought together Chicago's elite, including Richard and Vanessa. Debbie, however, stood out, not because she was wealthy or glamorous, but because of her warmth and unassuming presence. Debbie's life had been vastly different from Richard's. Born in 1968, she grew up in a small town in Indiana as the youngest of 4 children. Her father was a truck driver, and her mother worked long hours as a nurse. Debbie struggled with her weight from an early age, a fact that often made her the target of cruel teasing at school. Despite this, she was known for her gentle nature and kind spirit. She worked tirelessly to support her family, putting her siblings through college while giving up her own dreams of becoming an artist. By 2005, Debbie had moved to Chicago and taken a job as a receptionist at a local law firm. Though she found some stability, her life was lonely. She longed for a deep connection, but struggled with self-doubt and feelings of unworthiness. Attending charity galas was a rare indulgence, something she did to feel a sense of belonging in a world she admired from afar. When Richard first noticed Debbie at the gala, it wasn't her appearance that drew him in. It was the way she laughed easily, her voice carrying warmth and sincerity that felt rare in the room full of polished smiles. During the evening, their paths crossed several times, and though their conversation seemed casual, a shared comment about the food, a remark about the weather, something about Debbie's demeanor put Richard at ease. She didn't look at him with the awe or intimidation he often encountered. Instead, she treated him like an equal. Over the next few weeks, Richard couldn't stop thinking about Debbie. In November 2010, he reached out to her under the pretense of donating to the charity she supported. Their relationship began innocently enough. They would meet for coffee or lunch, talking about everything from their childhoods to their dreams. For Debbie, these meetings were a glimpse into a life she never thought she could have. For Richard, they were an escape from the relentless pressure of his own existence. As the weeks turned into months, their relationship grew more intimate. By early 2011, their affair had become physical, though Richard took great care to keep it hidden. To Debbie, Richard was a man who finally saw her for who she truly was, someone who valued her kindness and intellect rather than judging her for her appearance. She fell deeply in love, believing that Richard's feelings for her were as genuine as hers for him. But for Richard, the affair was a double-edged sword. While he found comfort in Debbie's presence, he also began to resent her. He hated the secrecy, the guilt, and the growing realization that his actions could destroy his carefully constructed life. By mid-2011, he started to distance himself, canceling plans and offering vague excuses. Debbie noticed the change but convinced herself that Richard was simply under stress. She clung to the hope that their love would endure. Richard's growing resentment only deepened his insecurities. Every time he looked at Vanessa, he was reminded of the life he had built and the one he risked losing. He began to question why he had pursued the affair in the first place. By late 2011, he was determined to end things with Debbie, believing it was the only way to regain control of his life. Unbeknownst to him, Debbie's feelings had intensified. She had started imagining a future with Richard, one where they could be together without hiding. Her love had become an obsession, blinding her to the reality of their situation. For Richard, Debbie was a complication he needed to resolve. For Debbie, Richard was the one thing that gave her life meaning. As the calendar turned to March 2012, Richard decided it was time to sever ties once and for all, unaware of how fragile Debbie's emotional state had become. This decision would set in motion a chain of events that neither could have foreseen, leading to a confrontation that would forever alter their lives. The morning of March 6th begins like any other for Richard. He's preparing for a business meeting when Debbie arrives unannounced at his penthouse. She confronts him about recent texts that suggest he's pulling away. Tired of the charade, Richard coldly tells her their affair is over, describing her as a mistake and a burden he needs to shed. Devastated and enraged, Debbie grabs a crystal paperweight from his desk and strikes him in a blind fury. Richard collapses, and Debbie panics. Seeing the blood pooling beneath him, she grabs a knife from the kitchen and plunges it into his chest repeatedly, ensuring he's dead. Overwhelmed with shock, Debbie flees the scene, leaving a trail of evidence behind. March 6th, 2012. At exactly 10:45 a.m., Maria Esteban, Richard Calloway's housekeeper for over 8 years, entered the sprawling penthouse in downtown Chicago. Maria had a predictable routine, cleaning the kitchen first, then working her way through the immaculate living room before moving to the master suite. The penthouse was usually silent at this hour, with Richard either away at work or locked in his study on calls. But today, something was different. Maria immediately noticed the eerie stillness. The air felt heavier than usual, and a faint metallic smell lingered, a scent she couldn't place at first. As she moved deeper into the penthouse, she began to feel uneasy. The kitchen was untouched, but the smell grew stronger. It was when she stepped into the living room that she froze. The sight before her was like something out of a nightmare. The once pristine white marble floors were smeared with dark red streaks. A trail of blood led from the glass coffee table to Richard's study. Furniture was overturned, as if a struggle had taken place. Maria's heart raced, but she forced herself to follow the trail, whispering a prayer under her breath. When she pushed open the door to the study, the horror hit her full force. Richard's lifeless body lay sprawled on the floor. His tailored shirt was soaked with blood, his chest bearing multiple stab wounds. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling. Beside him, the murder weapon, a large chef's knife from his own kitchen, was discarded carelessly. Papers from his desk were scattered, and a heavy crystal paperweight lay cracked on the floor, smeared with blood. Maria let out a scream and stumbled back. For a moment, she couldn't move, her legs trembling as she clutched the doorframe. Somehow, she managed to pull her phone from her pocket and dial 911. Her voice was shaky as she described the scene to the dispatcher, her Spanish accent thickening with panic. Within minutes, the Chicago PD was on its way. By 11:15 a.m., Detective Marcus Hargrove and his partner, Detective Erica Nolan, arrived at the penthouse. Hargrove, a seasoned investigator with a sharp mind for unraveling complex cases, immediately took charge. Nolan, younger but equally perceptive, began documenting the crime scene with a steady hand. Together, they examined the grisly evidence. The penthouse offered no signs of forced entry, which led the detectives to an unsettling conclusion. Richard had likely known his killer. The blood patterns and overturned furniture suggested a violent altercation. It was clear that whoever had committed this crime had acted out of rage, not calculated intent. Hargrove couldn't help but think this was personal. March 8th, 2012, the detectives began their investigation by questioning those closest to Richard. The first person they interviewed was Vanessa Calloway. Vanessa arrived at the station dressed in black, her face pale and drawn. Her grief seemed genuine, her hands trembling as she clutched a tissue. Despite her composed exterior, there was an undercurrent of pain that made even the detectives uncomfortable. Vanessa explained that she had been at her yoga class during the time of Richard's death. Security footage from the studio confirmed her alibi, showing her entering at 9 a.m. and leaving shortly after 11 a.m. She was visibly shaken when the detectives asked about her marriage. While she spoke highly of Richard's intelligence and dedication, she admitted that their relationship had become strained in recent years. She confessed she had suspected Richard of infidelity, but had chosen not to confront him, fearing the answer. Her words were measured, as if she were carefully controlling her emotions. The detectives noted her composure, but didn't press her further. Vanessa's grief seemed too raw to be an act. Instead, they turned their attention to Richard's phone records. The records revealed a pattern of late-night calls and text messages with a woman named Debbie Hawkins. At first glance, the exchanges seemed innocent, short, and cryptic. but the frequency raised red flags. The detectives dug deeper into Debbie's background, discovering that she was far removed from Richard's glamorous world. A receptionist at a small law firm, Debbie lived alone in a modest apartment on the outskirts of the city. March 12, 2012, Hargrove and Nolan visited Debbie Hawkins's apartment that morning. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where residents avoided eye contact and kept their doors locked. Debbie's apartment, located on the second floor of an aging brick building, was modest but clean. The detectives knocked, and Debbie answered cautiously, her face pale and nervous. She appeared smaller in person, her confidence seemingly swallowed by the weight of their presence. As the detectives began questioning her about Richard, Debbie's answers were hesitant. She denied having any significant relationship with him, insisting they were merely acquaintances. But Hargrove noticed the way her hands fidgeted, her fingers tugging at the sleeves of her cardigan. Nolan's sharp eyes caught faint scratches on Debbie's forearms, almost healed but still visible. When asked about her whereabouts on the March 6th, Debbie claimed she had been home watching TV. She couldn't recall specific details of the program she had seen, a fact that didn't go unnoticed by the detectives. Her unease grew as the questions continued. Nolan noticed her eyes darting to the small trash bin in the corner of the room, which was half full with crumpled tissues. It was as though she had been crying, perhaps recently. Back at the station, forensic evidence began to build a damning case. Fingerprints on the murder weapon matched Debbie's, as did prints found on the cracked paperweight. Surveillance footage from Richard's building confirmed her presence that morning. The footage showed her entering the lobby at 9:45 a.m., just minutes before the estimated time of Richard's death. She carried a large handbag, its contents unknown. March 20th, 2012. Armed with the evidence, the detectives returned to Debbie's apartment. This time, there was no hesitation. Debbie was arrested on charges of first-degree murder. As she was escorted out in handcuffs, neighbors peeked through their curtains, whispering among themselves. Debbie's face was a mask of fear and resignation, her tear-streaked cheeks betraying the calm she tried to maintain. The case was no longer a question of who had killed Richard Calloway, but why. Behind the physical evidence lay a tangled web of obsession, betrayal, and heartbreak. A story that would soon come to light in chilling detail. By the time the trial began in April 2013, the murder of Richard Calloway had already become a national spectacle. The wealthy tech tycoon's violent death, paired with the shocking revelation of his affair with Debbie Hawkins, captivated the media. Journalists swarmed the courthouse, eager to dissect every detail of the scandal. Headlines sensationalized the story, portraying Debbie as an unhinged lover who had been consumed by obsession, while Richard was painted as a tragic victim of his own reckless choices. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. The prosecution, led by the experienced district attorney Graham Linton, wasted no time painting Debbie as a scorned lover. Linton argued that Debbie's obsessive behavior and unbalanced emotional state drove her to kill Richard in a fit of rage after he rejected her. Using chilling evidence collected from Debbie's personal life, the prosecution sought to destroy any notion that the murder was accidental or defensive. Central to their case were Richard's emails, which forensic teams had recovered from his private account. In these messages, Richard confided in a close friend about his growing discomfort with Debbie's behavior. He described her as clingy and unstable, expressing regret over their affair and detailing plans to end it. The tone of the emails revealed Richard's anxiety. He feared Debbie might retaliate if he cut her off too abruptly. These messages were presented to the jury with cold precision, a stark reminder of how far Richard had gone to keep his personal life under control. But it was the discovery of Debbie's diaries that truly shocked the courtroom. Found during a search of her apartment, the journals spanned years of Debbie's life, chronicling her thoughts, fears, and dreams. What began as simple entries about her loneliness and desire for love eventually spiraled into pages filled with obsessive musings about Richard. She wrote about their secret moments together, often romanticizing their affair as a fairy tale, despite its undeniable toxicity. As the trial progressed, the darker entries emerged. Debbie had written detailed fantasies of a life where Richard left his wife, Vanessa, and built a new future with her. These fantasies were juxtaposed with confessions of insecurity and fear. She worried that Richard was growing distant, that he would abandon her, leaving her even more broken than before. The entries became erratic, marked by fragmented sentences and desperate scribbles. Some passages hinted at violent thoughts, though none explicitly described an intent to harm Richard. Still, the prosecution used the diaries to argue that Debbie's obsession had reached a dangerous breaking point. Debbie sat silently through these revelations, her expression a mix of shame and defiance. The defense team, led by attorney Martin Kelso, countered with an emotional plea, arguing that Debbie had acted in self-defense. They claimed Richard had attacked her during their final confrontation, and in a panic, she had fought back. Kelso pointed to the power imbalance between the two. Richard, a wealthy, influential man, and Debbie, a vulnerable woman who had been manipulated into an affair she couldn't escape. The defense leaned heavily on Debbie's character, calling former colleagues and friends to the stand to testify to her kindness and quiet demeanor. They argued that Debbie's writings, though troubling, were the product of a lonely and isolated mind, not a dangerous one. However, the prosecution struck back by dissecting Debbie's actions after the murder. Her decision to flee the scene, they argued, showed guilt, not fear. Vanessa Calloway's presence in the courtroom added another layer of tension. Dressed in black every day, she sat quietly in the gallery, avoiding eye contact with Debbie. Though she had initially been seen as a sympathetic widow, the revelation of Richard's affair made her a figure of public curiosity. Vanessa chose not to speak to the media or provide a victim impact statement during the trial, keeping her grief private. However, her presence alone was a reminder of the betrayal and loss she had endured. She was grieving not just her husband's death, but also the shattering of the life they had built together. By July 2013, the trial had reached its emotional peak. Closing arguments were fiery and impassioned, with the prosecution urging the jury to deliver justice for Richard Calloway, a man they argued had paid the ultimate price for his mistakes. The defense, on the other hand, appealed to the jury's empathy, asking them to see Debbie not as a monster, but as a flawed, desperate woman pushed to the edge. On July 2nd, 2013, after weeks of testimony and 2 days of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict: guilty of second-degree murder. The courtroom was silent as the judge read the decision. Debbie Hawkins sat motionless, her face pale, as the weight of her actions seemed to settle fully on her shoulders. The sentence was announced shortly after: 25 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 20. Vanessa, seated at the back of the courtroom, didn't flinch. She simply stood and left quietly, slipping past the reporters waiting for a reaction. Her decision to avoid public commentary remained steadfast. In the days following the trial, Vanessa began dismantling the remnants of her old life. She sold the mansion she had shared with Richard, donated many of their possessions, and retreated from the public eye. The trial left a scar on everyone involved. Debbie's conviction brought closure to Richard's family, but it also exposed the fragility of the lives they had built. For Vanessa, the betrayal of her husband's affair was a wound that might never fully heal. For Debbie, the realization of what she had lost, both Richard and her freedom, was a punishment that extended beyond the walls of her prison cell. The media eventually moved on, but the chilling details of the case lingered in public memory, a haunting reminder of how love and obsession can turn deadly. Richard Calloway's tragic end serves as a cautionary tale of how unchecked insecurities and destructive relationships can lead to catastrophe. Debbie, once a kind and gentle soul, became a symbol of how love, when twisted into obsession, can lead to unimaginable consequences. The story ends with a poignant note. Vanessa, years later, visits Richard's grave, reflecting on the life they could have shared had he sought help for his inner demons. Debbie, in prison, writes Richard's name in her diary every night, still unable to let go of the man she loved and destroyed.